My name is Jillian, 34 years old, and I never imagined that the worst day of my professional life would also become my sweetest victory. That Friday morning, when I was called into the HR office, after discovering millions in financial discrepancies, I saw the cold smile on the HR director's face as she slid those termination papers across the polished desk. She demanded I return all company assets immediately. Little did she know that her demand would become the biggest mistake of her career. Before I tell you how I brought down an entire company with a single document, let me ask where you're watching from today. Please hit that like button and subscribe, because this story about corporate karma is one you won't want to miss. Trust me, when you hear what happened in that boardroom, you'll understand why sometimes getting fired is the best thing that can happen to you. 3 years ago, I joined Technova Solutions as a senior financial analyst with such hope and enthusiasm. The company was a mid-sized tech firm with about 200 employees, positioned perfectly in the enterprise software market. From the outside, it seemed like a success story waiting to happen. The glass building gleamed in the business district, the lobby had that modern tech company feel with its open spaces and collaborative work areas, and the employee benefits package was competitive enough to lure talent from bigger firms. I threw myself into the work with everything I had. 60-hour weeks became my norm, not because anyone demanded it, but because I genuinely believed in what we were building. In my first year alone, I streamlined our financial reporting processes, implemented new cost control measures, and identified inefficiencies that saved the company over $3 million. The CEO, Marcus Thompson, personally thanked me at the company-wide meeting, calling me a rising star and an invaluable asset to the Technova family. How those words would later turn to ash in my mouth. 2 years ago, my life took an unexpected turn when my grandmother passed away. She was 92, had lived a full life, and went peacefully in her sleep. Among the things she left me was a commercial property in the business district, a building she and my grandfather had purchased 40 years ago as an investment. When I was settling her estate and going through the property documents, I discovered something that made me pause. The building housed several businesses, but the primary tenant occupying 3 full floors was none other than Technova Solutions. The lease agreement had been signed 5 years prior, before I even knew the company existed. When I informed Marcus about this inheritance during a casual conversation, his eyes lit up. He immediately launched into a speech about fate and family, about how this was a sign that I was meant to be at Technova. He even asked if I would consider keeping the rent at its current rate, which was already below market value, as a gesture of good faith to the company family. Like a fool believing in corporate loyalty, I agreed. The building was generating enough income from other tenants, and I thought maintaining good relationships with my employer was more valuable than maximizing profit. Everything changed 3 weeks before my termination. While reviewing quarterly expense reports, I noticed irregularities in vendor payments. At first, it seemed like simple accounting errors. A company called Vertex Solutions had received $2.3 million for consulting services, but I couldn't find any deliverables or even a clear description of what they had consulted on. When I dug deeper, I found more suspicious payments. Pinnacle Technologies. Another vendor had been paid $1.7 million for software licenses we never received. Matrix Innovations got $3.4 million for research and development projects that existed only on paper. The pattern became clear as I spent long nights cross-referencing invoices, approval signatures, and bank transfers. These weren't real companies providing actual services. They were Shell's elaborate facades created to siphon money from Technova. The signatures on the approval documents were forgeries skilled enough to pass casual inspection, but clearly fake under scrutiny. The most damning discovery was that funds raised from our latest investor, around $30 million, meant for product development and market expansion, had been systematically diverted to these ghost companies. My first instinct was to follow proper channels. I compiled my initial findings into a comprehensive report and requested a meeting with our CFO, Kenneth Walsh. He was a tall, distinguished man in his 50s, who always wore perfectly pressed suits and spoke in measured, careful tones. When I presented my concerns, his expression never changed. He thanked me for my diligence, said he would look into it personally, and assured me that there must be reasonable explanations for everything. He even complimented my attention to detail and said it was exactly this kind of thorough review that made me such an asset to the company. But nothing happened. A week passed then too. When I followed up, Kenneth said the matter was being handled at the executive level and that I should focus on my regular duties. That's when I knew the rot went all the way to the top. If Kenneth was involved, and his dismissive response suggested he was then going through normal channels, would only give them time to cover their tracks or worse, set me up as a scapegoat. I started working more carefully, more secretly. I stayed late always with a legitimate project as cover, and systematically photographed documents, downloaded files to encrypted drives, and built an airtight case. I discovered the fraud went back at least 2 years and involved over $20 million. The main players appeared to be Marcus himself, Kenneth, and at least 2 board members who had signed off on the fraudulent transactions. They were preparing to sell the company to a larger competitor, using the cooked books to inflate the valuation by almost double. The buyers would only discover the truth after the deal closed, by which time Marcus and his conspirators would have walked away with hundreds of millions. Thursday evening, the night before my termination, I stayed until almost midnight, organising everything I had discovered. I was preparing to reach out directly to the independent board members, the ones who weren't implicated in the scheme. The security guard did his usual rounds, nodding at me as he passed my office. I should have noticed something was off when he came by a second time, just 20 minutes later, peering at my computer screen longer than usual. The next morning, Friday, I had barely settled at my desk with my coffee when my phone rang. It was Patricia Hawkins, the HR director, her voice clipped and professional. She needed to see me immediately in her office. There was no explanation, no context, just the cold command to come at once. As I walked through the hallways, I noticed the strange quiet, the way conversations stopped when I passed the quick glances that looked away when I tried to make eye contact. Patricia's office was on the executive floor, a space designed to intimidate with its floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist decor. But what really set my nerves on edge were the 2 security guards standing by the door. In 3 years at Technova, I had never seen security present for any HR meeting, not even terminations. They stood there like statues, hands clasped in front of them, eyes fixed on some point beyond me. Patricia sat behind her glass desk, her signature red lipstick perfectly applied, her black suit impeccable as always. She was known throughout the company for her efficiency, her ability to handle difficult situations with a cold professionalism that left no room for emotion or argument. The smile she gave me as I sat down was the kind you might see on a shark that had just spotted its prey. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. The termination letter was already printed, sitting in a folder with my name on it. As she slid it across the desk, she began reciting what sounded like a carefully rehearsed script. I was being terminated effective immediately for breach of confidentiality and inappropriate access to sensitive files. When I asked for specific examples, she simply repeated the vague accusations, adding that the details were part of an ongoing internal investigation that she wasn't at liberty to discuss. The terms were harsh, even by Technova standards. No severance package, despite my 3 years of exemplary service. No continuation of health benefits, which would typically extend for at least a month. Nothing but a final paycheck for hours worked. Then she produced another document, a non-disclosure agreement that went far beyond standard terms. It essentially prevented me from discussing anything about my time at Technova, including the circumstances of my termination under threat of legal action. Patricia leaned forward, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a sympathetic tone, but came across as condescending. She explained that signing the NDA would ensure a neutral reference for future employment. Refusing to sign would result in Technova being fully transparent about the reasons for my termination with any potential employer who called. The threat was clear: sign and keep quiet or have your career destroyed. But then came the part that would ultimately be their undoing. Patricia produced a third document, a checklist of company property to be returned. It started with the obvious items like my laptop, company phone access cards and parking pass. But at the bottom of the list she had added a handwritten note that said, "and any other company assets in your possession." The way she emphasized those words, the way her eyes narrowed slightly as she said them, told me they suspected I had copied files, maybe stored evidence, somewhere they couldn't reach. I was given exactly 15 minutes to pack my personal belongings under the supervision of the 2 security guards. They followed me to my office, standing in the doorway as I placed 3 years of memories into a cardboard box. My coffee mug with the funny quote about spreadsheets, the small succulent I had nursed back to health, photos from company parties when we still felt like a real team. Every item felt like a small betrayal as I packed it away. The walk to the elevator was the longest of my life. Co-workers I had considered friends suddenly found their computer screens fascinating. Conversations died mid-sentence. Only Amy Chen, my closest friend at work, had the courage to meet my eyes. I saw her duck into the bathroom, and through the briefly opened door, I could hear her crying. Later, she would tell me that Patricia had sent a company-wide email minutes before calling me, warning that anyone caught communicating with me would face disciplinary action. The security guards escorted me all the way to the parking garage, watching as I loaded the box into my car. One of them, a younger man who had always been friendly during our previous interactions, looked genuinely uncomfortable. As he took my access card, he whispered that he was sorry that he didn't know what I had done, but it must have been serious for this kind of treatment. I wanted to tell him the truth, but Patricia was watching from the lobby windows, making sure her orders were followed to the letter. Sitting in my car after they went back inside, I finally allowed myself to really read the termination letter. The language was deliberately vague, but legally careful, designed to give them maximum flexibility while providing me with minimum recourse. But as I read the section about returning company property, particularly that handwritten addition about all company assets, a thought struck me that made me laugh out loud alone in that concrete garage. They had no idea that I owned the building. In all their planning and all their careful orchestration of my termination, they had forgotten or never knew that their landlord was the same person they were trying to destroy. The lease agreement was in the name of my grandmother's trust, which I now controlled. The morning they chose to fire me, they were literally standing on my property, conducting their business in my building, plotting their crimes under my roof. The irony was delicious, but more than that, it was an opportunity. Patricia had demanded all company assets in my possession. Well, the building that housed Technova Solutions was certainly an asset to the company, and it was definitely in my possession. The question was how to use this knowledge for maximum impact, not just for revenge, but for justice. I spent the weekend at my Uncle Robert's house, partly for emotional support, but mainly for legal advice. Robert had been a corporate lawyer for 30 years before retiring to teach at the law school. He was the one who had helped me understand my grandmother's estate, and he was the only person I trusted to help me navigate what was about to become a very complicated situation. We spread out all the documents on his dining room table, the lease agreement for the building, my employment contract, the termination letter, and copies of all the evidence I had gathered about the fraud. Robert put on his reading glasses and methodically went through everything, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. His expression grew more serious with each page he reviewed. The lease agreement was particularly interesting. My grandmother, who had been a shrewd businesswoman despite never having formal education, had insisted on several protective clauses. There was a standard 60-day notice requirement for termination, but more importantly, there was a moral turpitude clause that allowed for immediate termination of the lease if the tenant engaged in illegal or unethical activities that could damage the reputation of the property or its owner. There was also, ironically, a whistleblower protection provision that prohibited retaliation against anyone reporting suspected illegal activities. Robert looked up from the documents, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He explained that not only had Technova violated multiple aspects of the lease by engaging in fraud, but they had also breached the whistleblower protection clause by firing me for investigating their illegal activities. I had grounds for immediate termination of their lease, and they would have no legal recourse to fight it. But Robert advised patience and strategic thinking. Simply evicting them would create chaos, but might not expose the full extent of their crimes. We needed to ensure that the evidence reached the right people, that the independent board members and investigators got the complete picture before Marcus and his conspirators could spin the narrative or destroy evidence. That's when I remembered David Kim, a former Technova employee who had been fired 6 months earlier under suspicious circumstances. David had been a senior systems analyst who had raised questions about unusual database activities and unexplained changes to financial records. His termination had been swift and quiet, officially attributed to performance issues that everyone knew were fabricated. I had his contact information from a goodbye lunch we had shared, where he had hinted that something wasn't right at the company, but hadn't elaborated. I called David on Saturday afternoon. He was working at a smaller firm, now taking a pay cut, but sleeping better at night. When I explained what had happened to me and what I had discovered, there was a long silence on the other end. Then he told me his own story. He had noticed someone using administrator credentials to alter records in the financial database, changing vendor information and payment authorizations after the fact. When he reported it to Kenneth, he was told it was authorized maintenance. When he persisted, suggesting they implement better audit trails, he suddenly found himself on a performance improvement plan for issues that had never existed before. David still had contacts at Technova people who were growing increasingly uncomfortable with what they were seeing, but too afraid to speak up. He promised to reach out to them discreetly to let them know they weren't alone and that something was being done. By Sunday evening, I had heard from 3 current employees who wanted to help. They couldn't risk open support, but they could provide additional evidence and testimony when the time came. Amy was the most valuable ally. Despite Patricia's warnings, she called me from a burner phone she had purchased with cash. She was furious about my termination and had already suspected something was wrong when several good employees had been suddenly let go over the past year. She had access to Patricia's calendar and could see that there were multiple meetings scheduled with the legal team and what appeared to be crisis management consultants. They knew I had evidence and were preparing their defense. Amy also told me something crucial. There was an emergency board meeting scheduled for Monday morning. The agenda, which she had seen while delivering documents, included discussion of a potential acquisition offer and a review of financial projections for the next quarter. The board members who weren't part of the conspiracy would be there physically present in the building, making it the perfect opportunity to deliver the evidence directly to them. I spent Sunday evening preparing 2 packages of evidence. The first was for the independent board members, containing clear, irrefutable proof of the fraud with a summary that could be understood in minutes. The second was for law enforcement, more detailed and technical, with a chain of custody documentation for every piece of evidence. I also prepared a third package for someone else entirely. My college roommate, Sarah Martinez, had become an investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal. We had stayed in touch over the years, and she had always told me that if I ever came across corporate malfeasance, she would be interested. I called her Sunday night and gave her the broad strokes of the story. She was immediately interested, but needed verification before she could run with it. I promised her that by Monday afternoon, she would have all the verification she needed and an exclusive on a story that would make national headlines. I also called a locksmith company that serviced the building, scheduling them to arrive at noon on Monday to change all the locks on the Technova floors. The building management worked for me, and I instructed them to have security ready to ensure a smooth transition. I wasn't going to give Marcus and his team time to destroy evidence or remove company property that might be needed for the investigation. Monday morning, I dressed carefully, choosing my best professional suit, the navy one that made me look like I meant business. I printed all the documents at a 24-hour copy center, organizing them into professional presentations that looked like they belonged in a boardroom. I arrived at the Technova building at 9 a.m. sharp, walking through the front door with the confidence of someone who owned the place, which of course I did. The receptionist at Technova did a double take when she saw me walk in Monday morning. Barbara had been with the company for 5 years, and we had always been friendly. Her face cycled through surprise, concern, and then something that looked like relief, as if she had been waiting for something to happen. She reached for the phone, undoubtedly to call security or Patricia, but I calmly told her I was there to return company property as requested. The confusion in her eyes was almost comical. Within 3 minutes, Patricia came striding through the lobby, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown to confrontation. The smirk on her face suggested she thought I had come crawling back, perhaps to beg for my job, or at least a better reference. She approached me with that same shark smile from Friday, her voice dripping with false sympathy as she said, I couldn't be here, that I had been formally terminated and was now trespassing on company property. I remained calm, keeping my voice steady and professional. I reached into my bag and pulled out the laptop, setting it on the reception desk. Then came the company phone, the access cards, and the parking pass. Patricia watched with growing impatience, clearly expecting me to grovel or make some emotional plea. Instead, I continued reaching into my bag, this time pulling out a manila envelope that contained something far more significant. I held the envelope for a moment, savoring the weight of it, both physical and metaphorical. Then I extended it toward Patricia, saying clearly enough for everyone in the lobby to hear that she had requested all company assets be returned, and I was complying with that request completely. She took the envelope with obvious irritation, probably thinking it contained some attempt at negotiation or perhaps copies of my work files. When she opened it and saw the property deed, her face went through a transformation that would have been amusing if the stakes weren't so high. First confusion, her perfectly shaped eyebrows drawing together as she read the document. Then understanding, her eyes widening as she realized what she was holding. Finally, pure panic, the color draining from her face until her carefully applied makeup looked like a mask against pale skin. She stammered, asking what property deed, what this meant, clearly hoping she was misunderstanding. I explained, still maintaining that professional calm that I knew was driving her crazy, that she was holding the deed to the building we were standing in. This building, the one that housed Technova Solutions, was my property inherited from my grandmother and now under my complete control. Every square foot of office space they occupied, every conference room where they had plotted against me, every executive office where they had signed their fraudulent documents, it all belonged to me. The security guards who had arrived during our conversation looked at each other in confusion. Barbara at the reception desk had stopped pretending to work and was openly staring. 2 employees who had been crossing the lobby had frozen in place, sensing that something momentous was happening. Patricia pulled out her phone with shaking hands, turning away from me to make a call that consisted mostly of panicked whispering and the word emergency repeated several times. Within 5 minutes, Marcus Thompson himself appeared practically running from the elevator, despite his usual careful attention to executive dignity. His $1,000 suit couldn't hide the sweat that was already forming on his forehead. Kenneth was right behind him, along with the company's general counsel, Margaret Stone, a woman known for her ability to navigate any legal challenge. But I could see in her eyes that this was something she hadn't prepared for. Marcus attempted his usual smooth approach, the one he used to charm investors and board members. His voice was warm, friendly, as if Friday had never happened, as if I hadn't been escorted from the building like a criminal. He suggested we discuss this reasonably in his office, that surely we could come to some arrangement that would work for everyone. He even had the audacity to call me part of the Technova family, as if firing me had been some kind of misunderstanding we could laugh about later. I responded by pulling out a second document, the lease agreement with relevant sections highlighted in yellow. I pointed out the 60-day notice requirement for normal termination, but more importantly, I directed their attention to the moral turpitude clause. Given that I had evidence of systematic fraud, embezzlement, and investor deception occurring on the premises, I was within my rights to terminate the lease immediately. The words fell into the silence of the lobby like stones into still water, each one creating ripples of shock that spread through everyone present. Marcus tried to argue his charm, giving way to barely controlled anger. He threatened legal action, claimed I was attempting extortion, suggested I didn't understand the complexities of corporate finance. Margaret, the general counsel, tried a different approach, speaking about contractual obligations and the impossibility of immediate termination without proper legal procedures. But I had done my homework. Uncle Robert had made sure every detail was legally airtight. The commotion in the lobby had drawn attention from the upper floors. Employees were gathering on the mezzanine level, looking down at the scene below. Among them, I spotted Amy, who gave me the smallest nod of encouragement. Word was spreading through the building like wildfire. The emergency board meeting that had been scheduled for 10 a.m. was about to become even more interesting. Right on cue, the board members began arriving for their meeting. William Anderson, the lead independent director, entered through the main doors, pausing as he took in the scene. He was followed by Janet Rodriguez and Thomas Chen, both independent board members, who had joined the company with the best intentions of providing good governance. They looked at the gathering in the lobby with obvious concern. This was my moment. I approached Anderson, directly introducing myself, though we had met at company events before. I handed him a package explaining that it contained evidence of systematic fraud that he needed to review before the board meeting. His expression shifted from polite confusion to serious concern as I briefly outlined what he would find inside. $20 million diverted to shell companies, forged signatures on authorization documents, investor funds misappropriated for personal gain. Marcus tried to intervene physically, stepping between Anderson and me, insisting that I was a disgruntled former employee, making baseless accusations. But Anderson had been around long enough to recognize panic when he saw it. He took the package, as did Rodriguez and Chen when I offered them copies. The fourth board member, who had arrived, James Mitchell, one of the ones implicated in my evidence, tried to grab the package from Anderson, claiming it could be doctored evidence or corporate espionage. The general counsel advised everyone to stop talking, that anything said could have legal implications. But it was too late. The lobby was full of witnesses, employees, who had seen their CEO nearly assault a board member to prevent him from looking at documents. The independent board members were already opening the packages, their faces growing more serious with each page they reviewed. Anderson pulled out his phone and stepped aside, making a call that, based on the fragments I could hear, was to the company's external auditors. I announced loud enough for everyone to hear that due to the violations of the moral turpitude clause, Technova had until noon to begin vacating the premises. After that, the locks would be changed and access would be restricted to retrieving personal belongings only under supervision. The building's security, who actually worked for the property management company that I controlled, would ensure an orderly transition. I also mentioned that copies of all evidence had been provided to the appropriate law enforcement agencies. The board members huddled together, speaking in urgent whispers. Anderson emerged from the group and announced that the board meeting would proceed as scheduled, but would now focus solely on the allegations presented. He ordered Marcus and Kenneth to preserve all documents and electronic records, warning that destruction of evidence would be treated as a criminal matter. Margaret, the general counsel, clearly recognizing which way the wind was blowing, formally advised everyone present that the company was now under investigation and all standard protocols for document preservation were in effect. The media storm that followed my Monday morning confrontation broke faster than even I had anticipated. Sarah's article on the Wall Street Journal website went live at 1 p.m. with the headline, "Technova Solutions Faces Federal Investigation After Whistleblower Reveals $20 Million Fraud." The story was picked up by Reuters within an hour, and by 3 p.m. it was trending on financial Twitter. The stock price, which had been trading at $42 per share that morning, plummeted to $25 by market close. Inside the building, chaos reigned. The board had immediately called for a forensic audit, bringing in external investigators who arrived before lunch. Employees were told to step away from their computers, which were being imaged for evidence preservation. The FBI arrived at 2 p.m., serving warrants and beginning their own investigation. Marcus and Kenneth were escorted from the building by federal agents, their hands cuffed behind their backs as photographers from various media outlets captured the perp walk that would grace Tuesday morning's front pages. Patricia's termination came via email at 4 p.m. sent from the board directly. She was given 10 minutes to pack her personal belongings under FBI supervision as investigators wanted to examine her files and communications. As she was escorted out, she had to walk past dozens of employees she had terrorized over the years, people who had suffered under her cold efficiency and ruthless management style. No one said anything, but the silence itself was a form of judgment. The employee revolt that followed was something to behold. Amy had become the unofficial coordinator of an internal whistleblower group. By Tuesday 17, employees had come forward with additional evidence. The IT director, Carl Stevens, admitted he had been ordered to delete security footage from Thursday night, the night I had stayed late gathering evidence. He had pretended to comply, but had actually archived everything on a personal drive, knowing that someday it might be needed. The accounting manager, Jennifer Park, revealed she had been keeping duplicate copies of original documents before they were altered, storing them in a safety deposit box at her bank. She had watched the numbers being changed, had seen legitimate invoices replaced with fraudulent ones, but had been too afraid to speak up after seeing what happened to David and others who had asked questions. Now, with protection from the board and law enforcement, she provided crucial evidence that showed exactly how the books had been cooked. The investigation quickly expanded beyond what even I had discovered. The FBI found evidence of bribery in securing government contracts, with payments traced to offshore accounts linked to procurement officials. They discovered that the pension fund had been illegally borrowed from with IOUs that were never intended to be repaid. The fake acquisition deals weren't just about inflating valuation. They were part of a money laundering scheme that reached into international markets. By Wednesday, the full scope was becoming clear. The fraud totaled not $20 million, but $40 million over 3 years. The number of victims was staggering. 200 employees would lose their jobs when the company inevitably folded. 30 retirees who had invested their pension funds in company stock would lose most of their retirement savings. Several small vendor companies that were owed legitimate payments would likely go under, unable to absorb the losses. The property situation added another layer of complexity to Technova's collapse. They had nowhere to relocate quickly enough to maintain operations. Most of their servers and critical infrastructure were in the building's data center, which I controlled. While I allowed them supervised access to retrieve customer data and fulfill legal obligations, the company effectively ceased to function as a going concern. Employees were told to work from home, but without access to their systems and files, there was little work to be done. I received threatening phone calls starting Tuesday night. Blocked numbers leaving voicemails suggesting I would regret my actions, that I had destroyed lives and would face consequences. Uncle Robert insisted I stay with him for safety, and the FBI took the threat seriously enough to investigate. They traced several calls back to associates of Marcus, who were also implicated in the fraud. The intimidation attempts only added obstruction of justice and witness tampering to the growing list of charges. But I also received support from unexpected sources. Former employees reached out to thank me for having the courage they had lacked. Current employees, even some who would lose their jobs, expressed gratitude that the truth had finally come out. Several said they had suspected something was wrong, but had felt powerless to act. My actions had given them a sense of closure, a confirmation that their instincts had been right. The legal proceedings moved with surprising speed. Marcus and Kenneth were denied bail, deemed flight risks, given their access to offshore accounts. Patricia, while not arrested initially, was informed she was a target of the investigation and advised to retain criminal counsel. The two board members implicated in the fraud, James Mitchell and Robert Hayes, resigned immediately and lawyered up, though their resignations wouldn't protect them from prosecution. On Thursday, I received a call from Anderson, the lead independent board member. He thanked me for bringing the evidence forward and apologised on behalf of the board for the retaliation I had faced. He informed me that the board had voted to cooperate fully with all investigations and to pursue civil action against Marcus and the other conspirators to recover stolen funds. He also mentioned that several major firms had already expressed interest in hiring me, having seen my integrity and analytical skills in action. The property sale happened faster than expected. A successful tech startup that had been looking for office space jumped at the opportunity to acquire the building. They offered a fair price, and I accepted with the closing scheduled for the following month. But I didn't keep all the proceeds. I set aside a significant portion to create an employee relief fund for the Technova workers who had lost their jobs through no fault of their own. It wouldn't replace everything they had lost, but it would help them transition to new opportunities. I also donated money to establish a scholarship at the local university for students studying forensic accounting and corporate governance. If my experience could help train the next generation to spot and stop corporate fraud, then something good would come from this mess. The university asked if I would consider teaching a guest lecture series on corporate ethics and whistleblower protections, which I agreed to do. The personal cost of everything was significant, but not unbearable. Yes, I had to deal with threats and intimidation. Yes, I had to leave a career I had built over 3 years. Yes, I had to watch innocent people suffer because of the greed of a few. But I also discovered a strength I didn't know I possessed. When pushed to the wall, when faced with corruption and retaliation, I didn't crumble or compromise. I fought back with the truth and won. My reputation in the industry, far from being destroyed as Patricia had threatened, actually soared. I received speaking invitations from professional organisations wanting to hear about corporate fraud detection and prevention. 3 major consulting firms offered me positions helping other companies establish better financial controls and whistleblower protections. I chose to accept a role with a firm specialising in corporate ethics and compliance, where I could use my experience to prevent future frauds. The grand jury indictments came down 2 months after that Monday confrontation. Marcus Thompson was charged with 37 counts of wire fraud, securities, fraud conspiracy, and money laundering. The potential sentence, if convicted on all counts, was over 100 years in federal prison. Kenneth Walsh faced 23 counts with a potential 60-year sentence. Patricia Hawkins, while charged with fewer counts, still faced up to 20 years for her role in the cover-up and obstruction of justice. The trial itself became a masterclass in corporate crime prosecution. The evidence I had compiled, combined with what the FBI uncovered in their investigation, painted a picture of systematic, deliberate fraud that had started small and grown into a criminal enterprise. Marcus had begun by inflating small contracts to boost his performance bonuses, but the ease with which he got away with it had emboldened him to think bigger. Kenneth had initially resisted, but was eventually bought with promises of wealth that would set his family up for generations. My testimony before the grand jury took 2 full days. I walked them through every document, every forged signature, every shell company transaction. I explained how I had discovered the fraud, how I had tried to report it through proper channels, and how I had been terminated in retaliation. The prosecutors later told me that my evidence and testimony were the cornerstone of their case, providing the roadmap they needed to unravel the entire conspiracy. The support network that emerged during this time was remarkable. Other whistleblowers from different companies reached out, sharing their own stories and offering advice on dealing with the emotional aftermath. There was an entire community of people who had risked everything to expose corporate wrongdoing, and they welcomed me with understanding and encouragement. Their stories reminded me that my experience, while painful, was part of a larger fight for corporate accountability. The industry whistleblower organisation not only offered emotional support, but also practical assistance. They helped me navigate the legal complexities, connected me with pro bono attorneys for my civil cases, and provided security consultation when the threats were at their worst. They also nominated me for their annual Courage Award, though I felt strange accepting recognition for simply doing what was right. The speaking engagements that followed allowed me to share lessons learned from the Technova scandal. I spoke at universities warning business students about the slippery slope of corporate fraud and the importance of maintaining ethical standards, even when pressured by superiors. I addressed professional organizations providing practical tips for identifying financial irregularities and creating corporate cultures where concerns could be raised without fear of retaliation. At one particular engagement, speaking to a group of young financial analysts, I was asked if I regretted my actions given everything I had lost. I thought about the question carefully before answering. Yes, I had lost a job, faced threats, and endured months of stress and uncertainty. But I had gained something far more valuable than any salary or stock options. I had gained the knowledge that when tested, I had chosen integrity over comfort, truth over complicity. The property resolution became a positive footnote to the entire saga. The tech startup that purchased the building transformed it into a vibrant innovation hub, replacing the toxic culture of Technova with one built on transparency and ethical practices. They even invited me to the opening ceremony, where the CEO publicly thanked me for having the courage to expose the fraud, saying it had created an opportunity for honest businesses to thrive in the space. The employee relief fund I established ended up helping over 100 families weather the immediate crisis of unemployment. Many of the recipients sent thank you notes, emails, sharing how the assistance had helped them avoid eviction, keep their children in school, or maintain health insurance while they searched for new jobs. These letters meant more to me than any corporate achievement award ever could. The scholarship program produced its first graduate last year, a young woman named Maria, who had written her thesis on corporate fraud detection using artificial intelligence. She sent me a copy with a handwritten note thanking me for making her education possible. She now works for the Securities and Exchange Commission, helping to catch the next generation of corporate criminals before they can do the damage that Marcus and his conspirators had done. Looking back now 2 years after that fateful Monday morning when I walked into Technova with a property deed that would bring down a criminal enterprise, I can see how every piece fell into place perfectly. The inheritance from my grandmother wasn't just a building. It was the leverage needed to ensure justice when the system had been corrupted from within. The timing of my termination, meant to silence me, had instead given me the freedom to act without corporate constraints. The legal outcomes exceeded even the prosecutor's expectations. Marcus Thompson received a 12-year federal prison sentence after a jury convicted him on 31 counts. His attempt to flee to a non-extradition country using a fake passport had been thwarted at the airport, adding years to his sentence. The millions he had stolen were being clawed back through asset forfeiture, though much of it had already been spent on luxury cars, boats and properties that were now being liquidated. Kenneth Walsh got 8 years, his lesser sentence, a result of eventual cooperation with prosecutors. He provided detailed testimony about how the fraud had been structured, who had known what and when and where additional evidence could be found. His cooperation had been motivated less by remorse and more by the reality that he was facing decades in prison if convicted on all charges. Still, his testimony had been crucial in securing convictions against the others. Patricia Hawkins received 5 years primarily for her role in the cover-up and the systematic retaliation against employees who had raised concerns. The judge had been particularly harsh in his sentencing remarks, noting that, as head of human resources, she had betrayed the very people she was supposed to protect. Her professional certifications were revoked, and she was barred from ever working in HR again. The 2 board members, who had participated in the fraud, Mitchell and Hayes, each received 3-year sentences and substantial fines. Their cases had revealed how they had used their positions to approve fraudulent transactions in exchange for kickbacks and favourable business deals for their other ventures. Their convictions sent a strong message about board accountability and the serious consequences of failing in fiduciary duties. Technova Solutions officially dissolved 6 months after the scandal broke. The assets were liquidated and distributed to creditors and victims according to a court-approved plan. While investors and employees didn't recover everything they had lost, they received more than anyone had expected, thanks largely to the evidence that prevented the conspirators from hiding or destroying assets. The company name became a cautionary tale in business schools, a prime example of how corporate fraud ultimately destroys not just finances, but lives and communities. My consulting firm, which I launched a year after the scandal, focused specifically on helping companies establish robust internal controls and genuine whistleblower protections. Not the kind that exist only on paper, but real systems that protect employees who raise concerns and ensure those concerns are properly investigated. We worked with companies across the country, many of whom had been shocked by the Technova scandal and wanted to ensure nothing similar could happen in their organizations. The work was meaningful in ways I never expected. Every policy we implemented, every training session we conducted, every whistleblower hotline we established represented potential fraud, prevented jobs, saved retirements, protected. Former Technova employees often reached out when they saw news about our work, thanking me again for having the courage to stand up when it mattered most. The Securities and Exchange Commission ended up using the Technova case as a template for new regulations around corporate governance and fraud detection. They invited me to participate in a task force developing guidelines for protecting whistleblowers and ensuring their concerns reached appropriate authorities, even when internal channels were compromised. The resulting regulations, while not perfect, made it harder for future conspirators to silence those who discovered their crimes. The personal transformation I underwent through this experience was profound. The woman who had walked into Technova 3 years earlier, eager to please and believing in corporate loyalty, was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that integrity isn't negotiable, that standing up to power isn't just possible but necessary, and that sometimes the worst professional betrayal can become the catalyst for discovering your true purpose in life. The relationships forged during this trial by fire proved more valuable than any corporate network. Amy, who had risked her own job to help me, became my business partner in the consulting firm. David, the analyst, who had been fired before me, joined us as our technical director. Together, we built something based on the values that Technova had only pretended to embrace: transparency, integrity, and genuine care for all stakeholders. When people ask me if I would do it all again, knowing what I would go through, the answer is always yes. Not because it was easy or pleasant, but because it was right. Every employee who thanked me for exposing the truth, every retiree who recovered even part of their pension, every future victim saved by the regulations and awareness that resulted from the scandal, they all made the journey worthwhile. The building that had been the scene of so much corruption now housed companies committed to ethical business practices. The scholarship recipients were entering the workforce armed with knowledge about corporate fraud and the courage to fight it. The consulting firm was helping organizations build cultures where fraud was less likely to take root and more likely to be exposed if it did. They thought they were taking everything from me when they fired me that Friday morning. Patricia's cold smile, Marcus's fake concern, Kenneth's dismissive attitude. They all believed they had won, that they had successfully silenced another potential threat to their criminal enterprise. What they didn't understand was that integrity isn't a company asset you can demand back in a termination letter. It's not something that can be confiscated by security guards or nullified by a non-disclosure agreement. Integrity is the one thing that once you truly possess it, no one can ever take away. It becomes part of who you are, a core strength that actually grows stronger when tested. They could take my job, my access card, my company laptop, but they couldn't take my knowledge of what was right and my determination to act on that knowledge. Sometimes the worst professional betrayal becomes the catalyst for discovering your true purpose. I thought my purpose was to be a good financial analyst to help a company succeed through careful management of resources. But my real purpose, discovered in the crucible of corporate corruption and personal attack, was to be a guardian against fraud, a protector of those without power, a voice for truth in organizations where lies had become standard operating procedure. And that property deed, it wasn't just a piece of paper establishing ownership of a building. It was poetic justice served on corporate letterhead. The very ground they stood on while plotting their crimes, the offices where they forged documents and diverted millions, the conference rooms where they planned my termination and their cover-up, it all belonged to the woman they were trying to destroy. The building that housed their criminal enterprise became the instrument of their downfall. The lesson I learned and now teach others is this: when you stand up to corruption, you don't just save yourself. You save the jobs of hundreds of innocent employees, the retirements of dozens of elderly investors, the futures of small businesses that depend on honest dealings. You prevent future victims by exposing the tactics and creating awareness. You inspire others who have been silenced by fear to find their voices and speak their truths. The most profound impact, though, is on yourself. When you choose integrity over comfort, Truth over silence, courage over fear, you discover a strength you never knew existed. You learn that you can face threats and intimidation without breaking, that you can lose everything material and still feel wealthy in spirit, that you can stand alone against powerful adversaries and emerge victorious through the simple act of telling the truth. Every whistleblower's story is different, but they all share common themes. The moment of discovery when you realize something is terribly wrong. The internal struggle between speaking up and staying safe. The retaliation that inevitably comes when you choose to act. The long, difficult journey through investigations and legal proceedings. And finally, hopefully, the vindication when truth prevails and justice is served. My story had all these elements, but it also had something unique that property deed. The cosmic irony of a company conducting fraud while literally standing on their victim's property was too perfect to be fiction. Yet it was real, and it provided not just the means for justice, but a satisfying symmetry to the entire saga. They demanded all company assets, and I gave them exactly what they asked for, just not in the way they expected. What strikes me most looking back is how many people knew something was wrong but felt powerless to act. The security guard, who was ordered to delete footage and knew it was covering something up. The accountant who watched numbers being altered but feared for her job. The board members who suspected irregularities but didn't want to rock the boat. Each of them was a potential hero who chose silence until the day one person's courage gave them permission to speak. That's why I continue this work. Why I spend my days helping companies build better systems and teaching employees to recognize and report fraud. Every person trained, every system implemented, every culture improved represents potential fraud, prevented lives, protected futures, secured. The $40 million stolen by Marcus and his conspirators was eventually recovered, at least partially, but the damage they did to trust, to careers, to communities that took much longer to heal. When young professionals ask me for career advice, I tell them this: your integrity is your most valuable asset. Skills can be learned, experience can be gained, connections can be built, but integrity once lost is almost impossible to recover. When you're faced with a choice between doing what's right and doing what's safe, remember that safety is temporary, but integrity is permanent. The job you keep by staying silent about wrongdoing will never be worth the person you become by speaking up. To those currently facing similar situations, working in companies where they've discovered fraud or corruption, I want you to know that you're not alone. There are resources available, laws that protect you, people who will support you. Document everything, seek legal counsel, protect yourself, but don't let fear silence you completely. The truth has a way of coming out eventually, and it's better to be on the right side when it does. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to choose between your job security and your integrity? What did you choose, and how did it change your life? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories about people who stood up against corporate corruption and won. Share this with anyone who needs to hear that speaking truth to power isn't just possible, it's necessary. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, your integrity is the one asset no one can ever take away from you unless you let them.